All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to run through the solutions to this that we did in class. There'll be a little bit of lag because this thing takes a little while to catch up. All right, so how do you find velocity on an x versus t graph? You find the slope. How do you find displacement on a v versus t graph? You find the area under the curve. How do you find acceleration on a v versus t graph? You find the slope. Okay, let's take a quiz really quickly. How do you find displacement from a v versus t graph? You find the area under the curve. How do you find displacement from an x versus t graph? You find the change in position along the vertical axis. How do you find velocity from an x versus t graph? You find the slope. How do you find velocity from a velocity time graph? You find velocity from the vertical axis. And how do you find acceleration from a v versus t graph? By finding the slope. Now let's do some matching. We're going to match these word descriptions to the graphs. So let's start with this one, an object that changes direction. That would be this one. A constant negative velocity on an x versus t graph. So these are the only two graphs I'm going to look at because they're the only x versus t graphs. So I want a negative velocity on an x versus t graph. This is an x versus t graph that is dropping from left to right, and the slope on an x versus t graph is velocity. This has a negative slope, so those two match. Now I want a constant positive acceleration on a v versus t graph. So the only graphs I want to look at are velocity time graphs. These are the only velocity time graphs. I want a constant positive acceleration. This is a constant positive velocity. On a velocity time graph, the slope of the line gives acceleration. This is a positive slope, so this one gives a positive constant acceleration. A constant positive acceleration on an x versus t graph. So this is the only x versus t graph I have, and acceleration on an x versus t graph should be a curve. So those two match. And then a constant positive velocity on a v versus t graph. This is a v versus t graph. Velocity is positive and remains the same. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful. Watch it again if you need to, or go to your book of physics and review the pages in the book of physics that cover this unit. If you recall, you need to look at the area under the curve page in the book of physics, which I believe is page 17, although you need to look in the table of contents to verify that. And then pages 24 through 32 in the book of physics. However, you are not responsible for page 31.